educator, pilot, athlete, president of a college. Who is it? It's the famous Roscoe Brown. And I'm happy to have my friend, Dr. Roscoe Brown, here today. Thanks for being here, Roscoe.
Okay, Mike, great to be here.
So, Roscoe, I'm on your seat today. You know, we changed places over here, you know, because you've been on CUNY TV. You've been in the TV and the media business for probably close to 50 years. So let's tell people a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about your parents. You know, your father, Roscoe Sr., and your mother were very interesting people.
Well, I grew up in the early part of the 20th century, born in 1922. Both my mother and father were professionals. My mother was a teacher, graduated from Virginia Union University, and my father was a dentist who later became a public health official.
Right, and he graduated from Howard.
He graduated from Howard. The other thing is he graduated from the high school that I went to later.
Dunbar
High School, but at that time it was located on M Street. It was called M Street High School. They built a new building, which they then named Dunbar High School. And that Dunbar High School had really educated many of the outstanding black leaders. The first black federal judge, William Hastie, came from Dunbar High School. Charles Drew, who developed the blood bank, came from Dunbar High School. Lots of lawyers and doctors came from Dunbar High School. So I grew up with an educated background, and at that time, in the 20s and 30s, Washington, D.C. had the largest black middle class of any community in the country, and that was because of the government work. The civil service, as it is today, helped to bring about the middle class.
Now, you told me that your grandfather worked for the Treasury Department, right?
Yeah, my grandfather worked for they called it Bureau of Engraving, and his job was to count out the new money. And they said that Grandpa Brown was so fast that they didn't know exactly how much money there was, and they counted it again. It was just perfect. So he worked there for many, many years.
But then Grandpa Brown, how'd your parents stay in the Virginia neighborhood? How'd they end up in Virginia?
My father was born in Alexandria, Virginia. My mother was born in Richmond, Virginia. And at that time, both of them had jobs that were service jobs, but because they were educated and because of the color situation, they were able to get good jobs. And they lived a good middle-class life. A number of people today don't realize that even in segregation, many blacks lived a good life. In the black community, they had their own theaters, their own stores, their own newspapers, their own beauty shops, their own restaurants, their own banks. And that's the way this black middle class that Du Bois talked about in The Talented Tenth came about. And I happened to be fortunate by accident of birth to be part of that.
Now, what was interesting, your father was a dentist, and then he went into public service, right? He went to work.
Well, what happened with my father, he was, at the beginning of World War I, he was recruited to be a public health educator, to go to the troops and talk about preventing venereal disease, preventing tuberculosis. While he was doing that, he was teaching chemistry at Virginia Union University, and he had an explosion, and then he lost his right eye as a result of that. So all of my life, he had one eye, but he drove, he played baseball, did everything else that everybody else would do. So he was a great role model for me.
Now, when you were growing up and going to Dunbar High, how did you decide to go to Springfield University?
Well, I lived on Girard Street in Washington, D.C., which was about 3 blocks from Howard University. And the director of athletics had a group called the Howard Cubs. So we would play ball among ourselves on the Howard University campus. He was a graduate of Springfield College, which was the place where basketball was invented, and volleyball was invented, and sports medicine was invented. So I had the option of either going to Howard or going to Dartmouth or going to Springfield. I chose Springfield because I could major both in health education, which my father was doing, and in pre-medical studies, which I was interested in, and could play sports.
Right, but you took 3 majors in college, right?
I took the chemistry major, pre-med major, and a health and physical education major. And the reason I chose that is because of the motto of Springfield College, which was mind, body, and spirit. Springfield College was founded by the YMCA. And at that time, there was so much prejudice, there were few blacks who would go to any of the so-called white schools. Springfield College had probably the largest number of the New England colleges, about 15 or 16 of us out of about 650, whereas there may have been two or three at Dartmouth, one or two at Harvard, one or two at Amherst. And I felt that I'd have an opportunity to play sports. I wanted to play football, I wanted to play baseball, I wanted to play basketball.
But you played lacrosse, right?
In addition to that, I was one of the first blacks to play lacrosse because lacrosse, which is a very popular sport down in Maryland and Virginia, I knew about it but had never played, never had the opportunity. But during the spring, many of the football players would play lacrosse to keep in shape. So rather than play baseball, I decided to play lacrosse, which is a really great game. And still, there are a few blacks who play it, although the greatest lacrosse player of all time was Jim Brown from Syracuse University.
It's interesting. So you enter Springfield in 1940, right?
I went to Springfield 39.
39, and the war begins later on, but let's talk about it because you had an interesting time. You entered Springfield, and then when the war broke out, you changed careers a little bit, right? ROTC, you were involved with ROTC?
Well, actually, at Dunbar High School, they had high school ROTC, and they had what they call a competitive drill. You dress up, march, and shoot. And during the summer, I went to the civilian military training camp, and I earned a second lieutenant's commission by the time I was 18. So when the war broke out and they instituted the draft, they decided to call me to active duty as a second lieutenant in my junior year. I then resigned my commission because the draft day was 21, I was 18, and then re-enlisted as an aviation cadet to become a pilot because I had always wanted to fly, like many of the so-called Tuskegee Airmen, but because of the racism and the War Department study in 1925 that said that blacks didn't have the intelligence or the coordination or the leadership ability to be pilots, there were no blacks in the Air Force. So that the Tuskegee program that came about because of the protests of the NAACP and the civil rights groups at the beginning of World War II opened the door for us to be trained at Tuskegee. And I had that opportunity, and I re-enlisted to be a Tuskegee Airman.
You graduated college in 1943, right?
That's right.
And in 1943, you then you take the training to be a Tuskegee Airman.
Yeah, I graduated college, was valedictorian in my class. On March 12th, I think, was graduation. On March 14th, I was on the train down to Keesler Field in Mississippi, Biloxi, Mississippi, where we got our first orientation to the military. And then in July, they sent us over to Tuskegee, where we actually began our pre-flight training, which was exercise and classroom work. And then from there, we went to the Tuskegee Army Air Base. Interesting enough, because of segregation, the government spent over $1 million to design a separate air base for blacks to learn to fly. It so happened the air base was designed by the McKissick firm, which are still well-known black architects and construction people. But that was the opportunity that they gave us because Tuskegee University was a premier university founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881, had large numbers of professionals there. So even though it was segregated, there was a supportive climate of black professionals and technical people. And that, I think, together with the leadership of Colonel Noel Parrish, who was the commander of that base, is what made it possible for us to get first-class training. We got as good training, or maybe better training, than the white pilots, and 3,000 of us were recruited to be pilots, 1,000 of us graduated, but another 1,000 could have graduated if there had not been segregation and the so-called quota system.
the role of the Tuskegee Airmen was to protect the bombers, right? And I mean, it relates well. I mean, earlier this year, the movie Red Tails came out, and during just a couple of days before Memorial Day, the DVD Red Tails came out, which talks about the Tuskegee Airmen. It talks more about the battles, okay, that they took care of, as opposed to the development Tuskegee Airmen. But you were telling me that part of the role of the Tuskegee Airmen was to protect the bombers from the German planes.
Well, that was the role that we ended up in. But like everything with the Tuskegee Airmen, we had to struggle. The Tuskegee Airmen were first founded as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which is one squadron of 16 planes, 33 pilots. Later, they realized that white groups would not allow them to fly with them, so they then created the Hunter Squadron, the 301st, 302nd, which later became the 332nd Fighter Group. But while the 332nd Fighter Group was being trained, the 99th went overseas and was attached to a white group, the 33rd Fighter Group, that had a prejudiced commander. And so the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th, did not get escort missions. They got ground support missions flying over ships. And it wasn't until the 332nd came over and the military, the Air Force, started losing lots of bombers. On some missions, they would lose 25 and 30 bombers. On every bomber, there were 10 planes. They were losing 250, 350, 400 planes. And they realized they needed to protect the bombers. So then the 15th Air Force, the 8th Air Force got P-51 Mustangs, which could escort the bombers all the way to the target. And that's when they gave the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd, the Red Tails, the opportunity to fly escort over the bombers and to protect them. And we were called Red Tails because we flew silver P-51s with shining red tails.
Now, you also were in the number 7, Bunny, and Bunny was named after?
After my daughter, who had just been born when I graduated from flying school, and Bunny Red 7, we call it, because it was number 7, red tail, and she's Bunny.
Right after the war, you decided that you wanted to become a pilot, and you went to Eastern Airlines. And what happened at Eastern Airlines?
Well, to backtrack a little, the 332nd became very famous because we stayed with the bombers and didn't lose them. And we flew on the longest mission of the 15th Air Force from southern Italy all the way to Berlin and back. And on that mission, we shot down the first 3 jets over Berlin, and I was the first to shoot those down. So we had a reputation. So when I came back, before I went to graduate school or medical school, I said, I want to fly an airline. So I went to the Eastern Airline office on Fifth Avenue, filled out the application, 1,000 hours, all kind of citations. And as I was leaving, the secretary was throwing my application in the wastebasket. I'd gone back to get my New York Times, and I saw it, and her face got red. She said, I'm sorry, we don't hire Negroes here. That was the official stance. And it wasn't until several years later that the airlines broke that and hired black pilots.
So as opposed to going to Eastern, you got a job working for the welfare department?
I worked for the welfare department, what they call
on 103rd Street?
So 103rd Street, in the area where Vito Marcantonio and the unions were very active. Actually, during the lunch period, in our union, we would pass out petitions to ask them to build housing developments. So many of the housing developments on the east side came as a result of the political action of the UPWA, Marcantonio, and some of the liberal Congress people. So that gave me an attachment to the community. I didn't grow up in New York, but very quickly, working on the east side, East Harlem, I learned New York. The interesting thing about it is most of my clients were older white people, because at that time they had what they call old age assistance, and the black population was not that large, and many of them lived in Harlem, and I worked in East Harlem, so that was where I got some empathy and some understanding of what poor white people went through, as well as what middle-class white people went
So
through.
now you have your bachelor's, and now you enroll in NYU. Tell me
Well,
about.
actually, before I enrolled at NYU, I took a job at West Virginia State
I
College.
forgot.
West Virginia State College was in West Virginia, which is a border state. It was not the rampant segregation. And there I taught exercise physiology, kinesiology,
And coach basketball.
and coached basketball, including the first black to play in the NBA, Earl Lloyd. Also coached football, and I also led the student movement to get more women involved in physical activity. So, but my president was Dr. John W. Davis, was one of the legendary people, one of the supporters of the Legal Defense Fund, and later came to New York to start the Errol Warren Scholarship Fund to train black lawyers in civil rights. And so after I'd been there 2 years, I told him I wanted to go back to graduate school. He helped me to get a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship.
Right.
Julius Rosenwald, founder of
Of Sears.
Sears, had this fellowship for blacks to get advanced degrees, and many of the black professors and writers and so on got that fellowship. I got one of the last ones. So between the GI Bill and the Roosevelt Fellowship, even though I had 2 children, I was able to go to New York University full time, get my master's degree, and then later work on my PhD degree, which I did in exercise science, exercise physiology, and ran the lab while I was there, and I got my PhD in 1951.
And then 1951, you continued at NYU.
Because I had this technical skill in physiology and biology, they made me a professor and instructor while I was working on my PhD. So when I got my PhD, I had the opportunity to become a full-time instructor, and then later I was able to get promoted to assistant professor, associate professor, and by 1960 I was a full professor at New York University.
And you created a program there. You were working for the African American Studies.
That was a little bit later. I started out as a full professor in health and physical education and educational psychology because I was working in physiological psychology. And then in 1964, I helped start the first program in a major college for underprivileged children who didn't have good backgrounds. The forerunner of the Sikh program, for example. That was called Project Apex, a program for excellence. So I developed that, and then from there, I became the president of the American Association of University Professors chapter, which was like our professional union for New York University. And through that, I was then able to help in developing the Institute of African American Affairs, which was in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King. I worked with President Hester, and he said, look, rather than just set up a separate Black Studies program, why don't we have a broader institute where we can do research on Black affairs, where we can do publication, we can do programs, and in addition, we helped to set up the Martin Luther King Scholarship Program, which brought 1,000 Black and Latino students to New York University, one of the first such programs in the country. So that has kept me going from one to the next.
And when you were at NYU, you were offered the opportunity to become president of Medgar Evers College of the City University. But you decided to stay on at NYU, and then in 1977, another opportunity came along. Took you this part, for the kid from Virginia, you went to the Bronx now, right?
I love the Bronx. Well, the one thing about going to Bronx Community College at that time was located on the uptown campus of NYU.
It was the old NYU.
Which they had
NYU
sold
Uptown.
to the City University in 1973, and they were going through a change in the president, and Bob Kibbe, who was the chancellor, asked me to be the president of Bronx Community College. Even though I had done a good job and had gotten the institute, I wanted the challenge to do something that would cover a larger number of people. The City University was the open enrollment university of the city, and I wanted to be there.
Now, some of the major programs that came out of that is that Bronx Community College is a 2-year school, so you can get an associate degree, but you also, people who didn't go on and moved to a 4-year degree, they had the opportunity of these 2-year programs. Let's talk about it. Nursing was one of them, and some other areas.
The Bronx Community College nursing program was one of the first community college programs in the city. It was a great program, our premier program. In addition to that, we had a mechanical technology program, we had an engineering technology program, we had a paralegal program, we had an ornamental horticulture program with the botanical gardens, we had a veterinary training program with the Bronx Zoo, and we also developed a major studio where we actually trained people in technology, so that the community college had two purposes: one, to prepare people to transfer to a 4-year college, and the other for a career, so that many of the students took their careers, entered their careers after getting their degree, and at the same time took advanced work to get their bachelor's degree. So I coined a term, gateway to success. That was our motto, gateway to success, and that really made people feel that even I'm in a community college, but I'm going to move ahead. I'm going to move ahead in my career. I want to move ahead in my education.
1993, you come now to the Graduate Center of the City University. Tell me about that.
Well, when I retired as president of Bronx Community College, I decided I wanted to do something in the area of improving the quality of education for everybody. So we set up the Center for Urban Education Policy, where we do work on key issues like open enrollment, like assessment, like teacher development, teacher evaluation. And I've been doing that since 1993, in addition to which I've been doing African American Legends on CUNY TV.
Now, but that's late. I mean, you got involved with media in the, the 50s or
In
the 60s?
the late 60s.
So tell us how you got involved with media.
Well,
you were an Emmy Award winner. You've been on NBC, CBS. You've been on national.
Well, again, part of this is to do with New York University. At the time, in the 60s, they had a program called Sunrise Semester on CBS, where they actually taught courses in the morning, you get credit. As an outgrowth of that, they decided they wanted to do a program on black literature. And in 1967, they started a program, I started a program called Black Letters, where Frank Maselli, who was a white professor, and I would read from black literature and talk about it. He from the perspective of a white liberal, and I from the perspective of an African-American professor. Then in 1970, 71, I started a program called Black Arts, where we interviewed musicians, people like Dizzy Gillespie, people like Lena Horne, people like Ozzie Davis, about what they were doing. And we also did some visuals. And out of that show, we won an Emmy Award because it did interpret what's happening in black arts. This program aired on Sundays and Saturdays, and a lot of people saw it. And then after that, I did another series at the time of the bicentennial in 1976 called Bicentennial, A Black Perspective for NBC. And then after that, I did a show called Freedom's Word, where we had actors reading from key documents, people like Cicely Tyson and Ozzie Davis, Danny Glover, reading from black literature.
And then you did radio, right?
And during that same period, I had a radio program at midnight on Sunday that went all the way across the country from WNBC called Solar Reason, where we'd interview folks from the black community. One of my first interviews was Spike Lee when he was just getting into the movies.
And then you came here at CUNY TV.
Came here and I did CUNY TV.
And you're still doing CUNY.
I'm still doing TV.
Yeah, but that you're taking my chair on that one.
I'm on the left side.
On the left side, okay. So you know, you've been involved. You have honorary degrees. I mean, you're getting one of the distinguished alumni at NYU. One thing that we were briefly talking. We only have like a minute. Your mentors in your life, your dad, and who else?
Well, my role model obviously was my dad because of his leadership, but it was Paul Robeson, a famous actor, singer. But the main thing is he was Phi Beta Kappa. He was a great athlete, and he was a great activist. And for young men of my generation, Paul Robeson was the person that we looked up to because the main sonar incorporates sonar, sound mind and sound body. That's what we believe. That's what Springfield College believed. And Paul Robeson was a great activist, even though some people disparage him because of some of his more definite statements. But the fact is, he was calling racism what it was. He was talking about freedom for everybody, and not just African Americans, but for oppressed people in Europe and Russia as well.
So here's what we got to do. I invited you to my show. You have to invite me to your show.
I definitely do. I want to know, how do you build New York?
Okay.
That's what I'm worried. I also am involved in Phipps Houses.
I know.
The housing project.
Okay. I wish we had another half an hour, but I want people to go see Red Tails. I'm going to get my own and enjoy the movie, and I'm really happy that I've had you today.
Okay, Mike.